In darkness you begin to stir. Bones ache, joints protest the morning. You rise, a slow uncurling against the weight of cold. Toward the hearth you move, a pilgrimage of necessity. Each step is a negotiation with stiffness. The fire has dwindled to embers, a fragile heart of orange in the ash. You kneel, the packed earth floor cold through your thin underclothes. Your hands, clumsy with sleep, select the fuel. A few precious sticks of birch, hoarded like silver, a handful of dry moss gathered in a kinder season. You arrange them with a tender care, a priest at an altar, a breath, a coaxing, a small prayer offered to the tinder. A lick of flame answers, hesitant, then hungry. Light blooms, painting the walls in sudden, jumping shadows. This is the first victory of the day. Now, the ritual of fabric and fur. Your garments wait heaped where you left them. They are stiff with cold, rigid with the night's frost. You lay them out before the new fire, one by one. Socks, leggings, tunic, coat, each a slab of frozen cloth. You stand shivering, skin prickling, watching. Waiting is its own kind of work. You watch the frost surrender, beading into dampness on the wool. The ice releases its grip, slowly, reluctantly. The smell of wet sheep and old smoke begins to rise. First, the linen shift. Rough, unbleached, it rasps against your skin. The seams are still damp from yesterday's sweat. You pull it on and it clings, cold and unforgiving. It is a violation, this first layer. It accepts you without welcome. Next, the woolen tunic. It is a history of damage. A patchwork of repairs, each mend a memory. A grey square from a sleeve torn on a snag. A brown wedge where an elbow wore through. You cannot recall its original colour. Was it ever one thing? It smells of lanolin and earth, of the animal it came from. You wrestle it over your head. The wool is thick, scratchy, a familiar irritation. It settles on your shoulders with a tangible weight. Then the felted leggings. Dense, heavy, woven from necessity. They're almost waterproof, which means they trap dampness next to your skin. You pull them up your legs, feeling the drag of coarse fibre. They itch instantly, a promise of distraction to come. You tie them at your waist with a braided cord. The outer fur comes last. Your most valued possession. Maybe it's a coat of reindeer hide pieced together from a dozen hunts. Maybe it's a mosaic of rabbit and fox, stitched over many winters. The fur is matted in places. Tiny crystals of frost, caught in the hairs, glitter in the firelight. You shake it, a small cloud of ice dust falling to the ground. Then you lift it. The weight is immense. You shrug it onto your shoulders, and the world narrows. You're no longer a person, but a thing bundled against the void. The fur smells of animal, of wood smoke, of all the winters it has seen. Your hands are the final problem. First, thin inner gloves of rabbit fur. Then, heavier ones of felt and leather, sewn with sinew. Ordinary thread would snap in this cold. Even these are not enough. You've learned the vital lesson. Keep them moving. Curl the fingers. Make fists. Never let them be still. Stillness is an invitation the cold will always accept. Your feet demand the same vigilance. Boots of compressed felt lined with wool. They're warm but useless in wet snow. Moisture seeps through in hours. Once wet, they become traps of ice. So, you pack them first with dried moss. You wrap your wool-swathed feet carefully, then slide them in. Over these, rough overshoes of birch bark or leather strips. One more barrier, one more fragile wall. It is never quite enough. You have seen frostbite. You have seen neighbours with blackened toes, the price of a moment's inattention. Every day is a careful treaty with the cold, a diplomat negotiating with a silent, pitiless king. This dressing is not quick. From waking to readiness can take an hour, sometimes more. In that hour you think of nothing but the mechanics of survival. Which garment to warm next? Which seam will give way today? Will the gloves last another day of wood splitting? There is no room for other thoughts. No space for plans, for dreams, even for much feeling. You perform the ritual as you did yesterday, as you will do tomorrow. Outside, the world is a study in white and grey. Snow smothers the land, rounding it into soft, deceptive curves. Beyond your settlement, the forest is a dark wall of evergreen. Snow loads the branches. The spaces between the trees are filled with a pale, sourceless light. The cold is a physical presence. It pushes against your face, finds every gap in your armour. You breathe through a cloth wrapped over your nose and mouth. To breathe the raw air is to feel a knife in your lungs. Each blink sticks your lashes together with ice. Frost gathers on your eyebrows. If you have a beard, it becomes a lump of ice in minutes. You learn to break it off, a tiny, repeated ceremony. Work begins as soon as you're clothed. There is always work. Splitting wood, clearing snow, tending to animals if you're lucky. Each task grinds at your clothing in its own way. Sawing wood wears the cuffs thin. Carrying loads strains the seams of your coat. Even walking through deep snow scours the leather of your boots. You move stiffly, hampered by your layers. Bending is difficult. Reaching overhead is an effort. You learn economy of motion. Plan each task to avoid waste. This is both practicality and a kind of meditation. Your world shrinks to the next immediate concrete thing. By midday, dampness gathers inside your clothes, your own sweat trapped between the layers. Now it works against you, pulling heat from your skin. You know this. You have lived it countless times. But there is nothing to be done. You cannot strip in the daylight cold, so you endure, feeling the cold creep closer with each hour. Food is taken quickly without ceremony. No lingering at a table, no savouring of taste. You eat for fuel, barley or oat porridge, dried fish, a hard piece of salted meat. The food is lukewarm, cooling fast in the air. You swallow mechanically, standing by the fire. In the afternoon, if there is time, you tend to your clothes. This is not optional. It is as necessary as eating or sleeping. You sit by the hearth with your sewing kit, a scrap of leather holding a few precious needles, a coil of homespun thread, dried sinew saved from butchered animals. You examine each garment systematically, looking for rents, for loose stitches, for thinning cloth. The light is poor, even with the fire. You hold the fabric close to your face, squinting. Your fingers are never warm enough for fine work, never nimble enough. So the mending is slow, imperfect, but it is essential. A small tear today is a gaping hole tomorrow, and a gaping hole can be the difference between enduring and succumbing. You patch with whatever you can find. Often, this means cutting a piece from a garment beyond repair, cannibalizing one layer to save another. The patches are crude, the stitches uneven, but they hold. That is all that matters. They hold. You rub animal fat into your boots, working it into the leather with stiff fingers. The fat helps shed water, keeps the leather supple. The smell is rancid, but you scarcely notice anymore. It is part of the background scent of your life. Wood smoke, unwashed wool, the sharp metallic tang of winter air. Sometimes you scrape ice from your outer coat with a blunt knife, chipping away the accumulated frost. Sometimes you hang garments near the ceiling, where heat from the fire rises. You watch steam rise from the damp wool like departing ghosts. These small tasks fill time. They are repetitive, monotonous, meditative. They occupy your hands while your mind sinks into a hollow calm. As evening approaches, the cold deepens. You can feel it. The air tightens. The cold finds a lower register, a note with no bottom. You retreat inside and begin preparing for the night. This means checking every seal, every crevice where wind might enter. You stuff fresh moss into cracks in the walls. You adjust the hide over the doorway, ensuring it overlaps just so. Not a sliver of outside air must slip through. Then you undress the outer layers, piece by piece. You hang them where they will be ready for the morning. The inner layers, damp with sweat, you keep on. There is nothing else to wear. To remove them would be to invite too much exposure to the night's chill. You lie down again in the darkness, pulling covers over yourself. Around you, the small sounds of family or neighbours, breathing, the rustle of turning bodies, an occasional cough or murmur. The sounds are comforting in their familiarity. They remind you that you are not alone. Others bear the same struggle, the same quiet desperation. Sleep, when it comes, is not deep. You wake often to cold, to discomfort, to check the fire has not gone out. Each waking is a small crisis, a moment to assess if you're still safe, still warm enough, still alive. Each time assured you return to a broken rest. This is your existence. This is what it means to winter on the Siberian frontier. Not adventure, not exploration, not something future generations will romanticize. Merely this: waking, dressing, working, mending, enduring, layer upon layer, day after day, a slow, grinding contest against a cold that never relents, against conditions that allow no error. Your clothes are not fashion. They are not expression, nor identity, except in the most fundamental sense. They identify you as a person who has not yet frozen to death. Every stitch is a small act of defiance. Every mend is a refusal to give up, even when giving up would be easier. You own little. Perhaps, if you're fortunate, 2 sets of outerwear, more likely only 1. You own your boots, your gloves, your scarf, your belt. You own the needles for mending and the thread you spun by firelight. These things are your wealth, more valuable than coins, for they are what you breathe through. You know the rich live differently. In the towns, merchants and officials wear coats lined with fox or sable. They have servants to help them dress, stoves that truly heat rooms, boots made by skilled craftsmen. But those people are remote, almost mythical. They exist in a different world, one you glimpse only rarely, if at all. Your world is this cold, this work, this repetition, the endless labour of maintaining the barrier between you and death. You know the names of the garments, the asterisk Militsa asterisk, borrowed from the Nenets, a hooded, reindeer skin coat worn fur in. You cherish it above almost anything if you can obtain one. Reindeer hair is hollow, each strand trapping air. Its insulation is unmatched by any other natural material. The asterisk Schuber asterisk, a full-length fur coat, so expensive you've never owned one. You've seen visiting officials or rich traders wearing them. You marvelled at their thickness, their evident quality. Such a coat is passed down through generations, a family heirloom, a token of status and survivability. You have your patchwork coat, your felted leggings, your straw-stuffed boots. They are barely sufficient. Morning bleeds into morning. You wake in the same dark, perform the same rite, face the same implacable cold. Your hands grow strange calluses from gripping tools through thick gloves, from endless sewing. Your shoulders ache from the weight of damp fur. Your feet, swaddled in layers of wool and felt, are never truly warm. You learn to accept this. True warmth is a fleeting experience, crouched by the fire or lying under all your covers at night. The rest of your existence is a state of managed chill. You learn to gauge the severity of the cold by subtle signs. The way frost patterns the inside walls of your dwelling tells of the temperature outside. The speed at which your breath freezes in the air informs you, is this merely cold or dangerously cold? The sounds of the forest, or rather the profound asterisk silence, asterisk, when birds and beasts have withdrawn, warns of the worst days. On those days, you minimize time outdoors, do only what is absolutely necessary and retreat quickly, for you know that even brief exposure can numb a limb beyond recovery. The social dynamics of the settlement partly revolve around clothing. You note who has acquired new fur, who's making do with increasingly threadbare gear. There is a subtle hierarchy, unspoken but understood by all. Those with better clothing can work longer, endure more, and thus have slightly better prospects. Families sometimes share a single good pair of boots, taking turns for necessary tasks. Children wear cut-down adult clothes, sleeves and legs shortened. They look like small, bundled creatures, almost indistinguishable from the snow itself. Envy exists, though it is rarely voiced aloud. When someone returns from trading with a new coat, you feel a pang quickly suppressed. You try not to dwell on such feelings. They are useless. They change nothing. They only make the cold feel sharper. Better to focus on what you can control. your own mending, your own small innovations. You learn to place a strip of birch bark inside your glove for an extra windbreak. You learn to tie your belt tightly over your outer coat, trapping warm air, preventing it from escaping at the hem. You learn that wool, even when frozen, retains some insulating property. Cotton, on the rare occasions you see it, becomes useless. These lessons are earned through discomfort and close calls. You treasure them like precious knowledge. You pass this knowledge to your children, if you have them, in the same quiet, matter-of-fact way. Survival is transmitted through generations like this. Not through books or formal teaching, but by demonstrated practice. By small tips shared over evening mending. By the example of those who weathered winters and those who did not. The rhythm of your days becomes so ingrained, you perform most tasks without conscious thought. Your hands know how to sew, how to pack moss into boots, how to adjust a hood for maximum protection. Your body knows how to move through deep snow without exhausting itself, how to conserve heat, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite. This knowledge is layered onto you, season by season, until it is part of you. You're a person shaped by the cold, defined by the struggle against it. Your identity, if you were to consider so abstract a thing, is wrapped in the practical concerns that occupy your everyday, keeping warm, staying alive, repairing what is broken, enduring what cannot be changed. There is a strange peace in this simplicity, even as it slowly wears you down. When you lie exhausted each night, at least you know you've done all you could. You performed the rites, you made the repairs, you took all the precautions you know. Whether it will be enough is not entirely within your control. Chance, weather, luck, all play their part, but you have done your share, and tomorrow you will wake and do it again, and the day after, and the day after that. For as long as winter lasts, the cold is not cruel, it is indifferent, which is perhaps worse. It does not care about your effort, your pain, your small victories. It is merely a constant pressure. A test you can never fully pass, only endure. And so you endure, wrapped in your layers, moving through the white silence, a small figure in a vast landscape, staying alive by cloth and fur and by a stubborn refusal to surrender. The materials you depend on are not sophisticated. Wool comes from sheep if they survive the winter. Shorn in spring, then carded, spun, woven by hand. The process is long, the results imperfect. The wool is uneven, thick in places, thin in others, full of plant matter that must be picked out by hand. Leather and hides come from any animal you can trap or trade for. Reindeer, elk, dogs, if necessity dictates. The hides must be scraped of fat and flesh, a process of hours that leaves your hands raw and stinking. Then they're tanned, either with birch bark or with brains, rubbed with a mixture of the animal's own brain matter and water to soften the material. The result is never fully supple, not like the leather you imagine exists in distant cities, but it serves. Fur is precious. Fox, rabbit, sable, if luck is exceptionally good, each has its character. Fox is warm but heavy. Rabbit is light but not durable, especially at cuffs and hoods where friction is constant. Reindeer hide is the gold standard, sought by all, for it is light, warm and tough. But reindeer are not always to be had, and even when they are, the hides command a high price in trade. Felt is made by layering wool, wetting it and beating it for hours until the fibres mat into a dense, almost waterproof fabric. The work is exhausting. The result is heavy, stiff, but felt makes the best boots, the best linings, the best emergency patch material. You can cut a piece of felt and sew it over a rent and it will hold for another season. Moss and straw are gathered before the first snows of autumn, stored in whatever dry space can be found. Moss is excellent insulation. Packed into boots, it traps air and wicks moisture from the skin. Straw serves a similar purpose, is easier to replace, but breaks down faster. Both must be renewed regularly. Pulled from the boots each night, dried by the fire, repacked in the morning. This daily rite is time-consuming but essential. Even birch bark, thin sheets peeled carefully from trees, finds a use in your winter kit. It can be layered inside boots as an emergency waterproofing, or cut and shaped into crude insoles. It is stiff, uncomfortable, but it works. That is all that matters. You use what is available, what the land provides, for there are no alternatives, no shops to visit, no catalogues from which to order. The forest, the animals, the plants, these are your suppliers, and they are not always generous. Your gloves are perhaps the most critical item you own. Your hands are your tools, the means of all your work. If they are crippled, everything becomes impossible, so you protect them fiercely. The gloves are two-layered, inner ones of thin, soft rabbit skin, outer ones of felt and leather, often fur out to shed snow. Extra stitching reinforces the thumb, for that is where tears begin. Some gloves have no separate fingers, just a pouch for the hand. Separate fingers lose heat too quickly. Keep your hands moving inside the gloves, bending, making fists, anything to keep blood flowing. You learn to do much work without removing them, performing simple operations with thickly wrapped clumsiness. You dare to take them off only for fine work. Delicate mending, handling a sharp tool, and then only briefly racing the cold that begins to numb your fingers almost at once. Your hood is equally vital. It projects forward, forming a tunnel that shelters your face from the direct wind. The inside is often lined with the dog hair, for it does not ice up as readily as other materials. Your breath will not turn it into a solid plate. You adjust it constantly, pulling it low over your brow when the wind bites, loosening it slightly when you need better vision. Becomes a second face, a barrier through which you peer at the world. The scarf you wear, the belt you tie, these are not ornaments. A scarf wraps the lower face and neck, preventing heat loss from these vulnerable zones. It filters the air you breathe, warming it slightly before it reaches your lungs. A belt cinches your outer coat tightly at the waist. That is a major place where heat escapes. Warm air, being lighter, rises and will rush out the hem of a loose coat, replaced by cold air from below. A tight belt traps that warm air, lets it circulate around your torso. These are small, practical details. They are the difference between relative comfort and misery. No one teaches them to you formally. You learn by watching, by trying, by failing and adjusting. You learn from the mistakes of others, by seeing a neighbour lose a finger to frostbite and understanding exactly what they did wrong. You learn from the indigenous peoples who have lived on this land for generations, though often that knowledge comes indirectly through imitation and adaptation, not direct instruction. The relationship between settlers and indigenous people is complex. Sometimes there is trade, sometimes mutual learning, sometimes conflict. But there is a shared understanding. Both are subject to the same pitiless winter. Your nightly sewing has a meditative quality in its repetition. The needle goes in, comes out, in, out, forming tiny stitches that pull torn edges together. Your needle is a precious tool. If it breaks, you must trade for another, or try to fashion one from bone, a difficult, imperfect process. So you are careful, never forcing it through too tough material, following the grain of the cloth. The thread itself is your own spinning, twisted from wool between your fingers or using a simple spindle. You produce long, uneven but strong strands. For some repairs you use sinew, the dried tendons of animals. It is immensely strong, does not rot, does not freeze. You must soften a strand of sinew in your mouth before using it. Make it pliable enough to work with. Then sew quickly before it dries again. The process is unpleasant. The taste is foul, but the result is reliable. A seam sewn with sinew outlasts one sewn with thread, especially in high-stress areas. The shoulders of a coat, the seams of boots. You keep a record of every repair, not with pen but with memory, with the visible biography of the garment itself. This patch represents the day a branch tore your sleeve while cutting wood. That reinforced seam is where your coat split under a heavy load. Each mark, each alteration is a story, a small record of survival. The clothing you wear is, if anyone could read it, autobiographical. But no one reads it, for everyone's clothing tells the same basic story: hardship, repetition, endurance. There is no choice in your wardrobe, no decisions about style, colour, fit. You wear what works, what you can make or trade for, what will keep you alive. If something wears beyond repair, you do not discard it entirely. It becomes rags used to patch other garments. Nothing is wasted, for everything costs too much time, effort and resource to throw away lightly. Over the long winter, your body adapts in subtle ways. Your fingers thicken, calluses grow tougher, you develop a better grip through thick gloves. Your skin becomes more leathery, less sensitive to minor cold. Your lungs adjust to breathing frigid air, though it always brings some discomfort. These changes are gradual, almost unnoticeable day to day, but they accumulate over years. You become in a sense a winter creature, shaped by it, honed by it. But you never become comfortable with it. Comfort is impossible. Acceptance is the best you can achieve. Acceptance that this is life. This is what survival requires. Complaining or wishing things were otherwise serves no purpose. And so you dress each morning in silence, layer upon layer. You work the day with a steady resolve, neither rushing nor dragging. You mend each night with patient attention. You lie down knowing tomorrow will be the same, and the next day and the next, until spring finally arrives and loosens its grip, at least temporarily. But spring is distant, almost unimaginable. Winter is the only reality that matters, and your clothing is your only shield against it. So you maintain that shield with everything you have. For to let it fail is to fail yourself, to give up the fight, to surrender to the cold, and you cannot do that. Not while there is thread and a needle, not while your hands can still sew, not while your breath still forms a cloud before your face. The struggle continues, silent, unending, layer upon layer, stitch by stitch, one frozen morning after another. In the winter of 1793, a child is born in a settlement so small it has no formal name, just post 47 inches on military maps along the eastern trade routes. The child is named Daniil Vasilyevich, son of Vasily. His first memory, one that will stay with him to his last breath, is of the cold. Not an abstract concept, but the specific feeling of it. How it seeped through the chinks in the log walls. How it made his mother's hands shake as she tried to feed him. How his father's breath condensed into clouds so thick they seemed solid in the dim morning light. Daniil's father was a trapper, one of dozens who worked the lines in the forest around the settlement. Vasily was not particularly skilled nor especially unlucky, just an ordinary man, and on the frontier that meant survival was never guaranteed, but not hopeless either. He caught enough to trade for grain and salt to see his small family through the hardest months, but never enough to build anything resembling wealth. The coat Vasily wore was a patchwork of rabbit and fox, added to over many seasons, each piece a replacement for another that had worn out. Daniil remembered that coat vividly. Some patches were dark brown, others a lighter grey. The stitching stood out like thick ridges, and the smell when his father returned from the trap lines, a mix of pine resin, animal musk, and frozen sweat. In the winter Daniil turned 5, his father did not return from the lines. A blizzard came down suddenly, as they sometimes did, transforming the familiar forest into a white void, every direction looking the same. Vasily likely tried to turn back, probably made it part way. But somewhere in that featureless expanse he stopped, perhaps sat down to rest, and did not rise again. 3 days later they found him frozen in a seated pose, his trap bag still clutched in his hands. The coat, stiff with ice, was brought back. Daniil's mother warmed it by the fire and wore it herself, for they could not waste such a garment. Daniil watched his mother wear his father's coat through that winter and the next. He saw how her shoulders did not quite fill it, how the sleeves hung past her hands. Even at that age he understood. The coat was more important than grief. Survival demanded such practical choices. By the time he was 8, Daniil wore the coat himself. His mother had taken it apart, reworked the pieces, removing what could not be salvaged, supplementing with scraps from elsewhere. It no longer resembled his father's coat, but Daniil knew that in its construction were parts Vasily had worn. gave him a strange comfort. He grew lean and quiet, not sullen, just inward, speaking only when necessary. His childhood was not unhappy, but it was measured by the same grinding repetition that marked all frontier life. Waking in the dark, layering on clothes, doing whatever work needed doing, mending what was broken, enduring what could not be changed. The settlement he lived in held perhaps 30 dwellings, scattered along a frozen creek. In summer, the creek ran clear and cold, full of small fish. In winter, it became an ice road, easier to walk than the snow-choked forest paths. The people of the settlement were a mix: ethnic Russians, exiles sent east for minor crimes or political reasons, a few indigenous families who had moved into the settlement over the years, drawn by trade possibilities. There were no strict divisions, no formal hierarchy. Everyone was too busy surviving to maintain such structures. You worked, you traded, you helped neighbours when you could, for you would need their help in turn, and you kept your complaints to yourself, for complaining changed nothing. Daniil learned to observe early. He watched how different families dressed, how they cared for their clothes, how they moved in winter. He noticed that indigenous families wore furs differently. Some garments fur in, others fur out, depending on the purpose. He noticed their boots were constructed with different stitching, seemed to shed wetness better. He noticed their children, though they had no more possessions, seemed to suffer less from frostbite and cold-related ailments. These observations gathered in him a quiet collection of details he did not yet know what to do with. He was not scheming or ambitious. He was simply curious, and curiosity was one of the few luxuries that cost nothing. When Daniil was 12, his mother remarried, a practical arrangement with a widower who needed help managing a household and a trap line. The man was not unkind, but not warm either. Daniil understood his place in this new configuration was as a worker, an extra pair of hands. He accepted it without resentment. That was how things were. He took on more outdoor work, checking traps, hauling wood. In the process, he spent long hours alone in the forest, with his own thoughts and the silent trees for company. The forest taught him patience. It taught him that rushing accomplished nothing, that careful at
complaining changed nothing. Daniel learned to observe early. He watched how different families dressed, how they cared for their clothes, how they moved in winter. He noticed that indigenous families wore furs differently. Some garments fur minus in, others fur minus out, depending on the purpose. He noticed their boots were constructed with different stitching, seemed to shed wetness better. He noticed their children, though they had no more possessions, seemed to suffer less from frostbite and cold minus related ailments. These observations gathered in him a quiet collection of details he did not yet know what to do with. He was not scheming or ambitious. He was simply curious, and curiosity was one of the few luxuries that cost nothing. When Daniel was 12, his mother remarried, a practical arrangement with a widower who needed help managing a household and a trap line. A man was not unkind, but not warm either. Daniel understood his place in this new configuration was as a worker, an extra pair of hands. He accepted it without resentment. That was how things were. He took on more outdoor work, checking traps, hauling wood. In the process, he spent long hours alone in the forest, with his own thoughts and the silent trees for company. The forest taught him patience. It taught him that rushing accomplished nothing, that careful attention to detail was more valuable than speed, that the difference between success and failure often lay in noticing small signs, tracks in the snow, a broken branch, the subtle shift of the wind. He applied these lessons to everything, including his clothing. When a seam tore, he did not simply sew it up. He examined why it tore. Was the thread too weak? Was the stress at a bad angle? He adjusted his repair accordingly. When a boot wore through, he studied the pattern of the wear and reinforced the vulnerable area before it failed. His clothing became a continual experiment, constantly refined, constantly improved in small increments. By 16, Daniel began to trade for furs himself, using the small surplus from his stepfather's trap line. He was not interested in wealth, not in the usual sense. What he wanted was simple, reliable, consistent warmth. He wanted garments that would not fail, that would protect him completely, that would free him from the constant anxiety of whether his coat would last another season. It seemed a modest ambition, but achieving it proved surprisingly difficult. Yet first were expensive. Then the labor required to make a truly effective garment was enormous. Daniel began to spend his evenings differently than most young men in the settlement. While others gathered to share what little alcohol they had, to exchange stories, Daniel sat by his fire and sewed. He practiced different stitching techniques, experimented with different materials, tried to replicate the construction methods he had observed in Nenet's garments. His early attempts failed. Seams that leaked wind, designs that were too stiff to allow movement, furs arranged in ways that did not trap heat effectively. But he kept trying, for he had nothing but time, and because the alternative was to accept that his clothing would ever only be adequate, never excellent. In the winter of 1809, when Daniel was 16, the settlement experienced what later came to be called the Winter of Empty Traps. The animal population, for reasons no one fully understood, crashed. The trap lines that usually yielded a steady trickle of rabbits and foxes came up empty day after day. The forest seemed empty, as if the animals had vanished into the white silence. The economic impact was immediate and severe. With no furs to trade, families could not obtain the grain and supplies they needed from the occasional trading caravan. With no new furs, there was no material to mend or replace worn clothing. Garments that should have been retired were worn longer, patched with increasingly desperate, ill-fitting repairs. People began to ration everything: food, firewood, even thread for sewing. The mood in a settlement grew tense, but the tension was quiet, unexpressed, a heaviness that lay over every interaction. Daniel saw families wearing clothes patched until the original fabric was nearly invisible. He sat chopping with fast-knitting fingers because their gloves had worn through and there were no replacements. He saw the elderly barely venturing outside, for their clothing was insufficient, and they knew prolonged exposure would be fatal. It was in this winter that Daniel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Through careful trading and hoarding, he had accumulated a small stash of furs. Not much, but enough to make one truly good coat for himself, the kind he dreamed of. They could have kept them, made that coat, prioritized his own survival. It would have been understandable, even expected. Instead, he began to give them away. Not directly, not in a way that would cause embarrassment. But by offering to mend people's garments and working his own materials into the repairs. An old woman whose shoulder seemed split got her coat back with the entire back partly enforced with rabbit fat from nowhere. Where a young father whose gloves were useless received a new pair, Daniel claimed he had made as extras that he did not need. People knew, of course, they were not fools, but they accepted the fiction, for it allowed them to accept help without feeling like objects of charity. Daniel said nothing about what he was doing. He simply continued working through the nights, his fingers cramping with cold and repetition, his eyes aching in the poor light. It was during these long hours of labor that he had his breakthrough. He traded a few small tools to a Nenet's elder named Koak for instruction on garment construction. Kylik was hesitant at first, suspicious of Daniel's motives, but gradually he warmed to the quiet young man who asked questions and listened seriously to the answers. Kulik showed him the principle of directional flow. Frank deer hide worn for minus and created a warm layer of air next to the skin. Firm minus outshed wind and snow, but the real innovation was combining both. A layer for minus in, a layer from minus out, creating a double barrier more effective than either construction alone. Daniel also learned sino minus, showing how to make seams that were not just strong, but truly windproof. How to cut and shape hides so they moved with the body, not against it. And the importance of hood design, a well-minus structured hood created a microclimate around the face. That could be the difference between comfort and frostbite. He absorbed this with fierce concentration, then began to experiment. His first hybrid coat was crude, an awkward marriage of Russian and Nenet's techniques. That did not work well. The proportions were off, the weight distribution unbalanced, seams puckered in places. That it was warmer, noticeably warmer, than anything he had worn before, and he knew he had found something. He made adjustments, tried again and again, slowly refining the design. By midwinter, he had created something genuinely new. Not purely Russian, not purely Nenets, but a hybrid. It combined the best elements of both traditions and performed better than either alone. He wore the coat working, testing it in harsh conditions. He noted he could stay out longer without discomfort. His core temperature remained stable even on the coldest days. Frost did not accumulate on it as it did on traditional coats. Then, very quietly, he began making similar coats for others. The process was slow. Each coat required weeks of work, and Daniel could only work on them in the evenings and on days free from other labor. He made them for the families struggling most, for those whose clothing had deteriorated to dangerous levels. He touched nothing, though he accepted the small tokens people insisted on giving: a bit of dried fish, a few candles, firewood cut and stacked. People began to talk about Daniel's coat, not loudly, not in a way that would embarrass him, but in quiet conversations by hearth. He talked about how so Maya and Nina's grandfather puffed less since he had the new coat, how the widow Maria could now fetch water in return without her lips being blue, her whole body shaking. They talked about how Daniel never meant to what he was doing, never sought recognition, just continued in his quiet, methodical way. Not everyone appreciated this. Some saw Daniel's blending of indigenous techniques as a betrayal, an abandonment of Russian identity. Some were jealous of his growing influence, resentful of their own inability to help in the same way. There were whispers that he must be profiting secretly, that he must be hoarding furs, that his modesty was an act. Daniel heard the whispers and disregarded them. He had no interest in defending himself, no desire to engage in the settlement's petty politics. He simply kept working, for the work was reason enough. When spring finally broke winter's hold with a sudden violence that marked Siberian seasons, Daniel had made or substantially repaired garments for about 15 families. In absolute numbers, it was not many, but in a settlement of 30 dwellings, it was significant. More importantly, those 15 families had weathered a winter that might otherwise have claimed some of them. No one thanked Daniel directly. That would have been awkward, would have created a debt that could not be repaid. Instead, people simply remembered. Years later, when he had help raising a new dwelling, dozens of half occurred. When his stepfather died, leaving him a small plot of cleared land, people came unbuttoned to help him work it. The settlement had no formal economy of favors, but it had an informal one, and Daniel had accumulated considerable credit in an invisible ledger. As he moved into his 20s, Daniel's reputation spread beyond the settlement. Passing traders began to hear of the young man who made special winter coats. Old, who blended traditions, who innovated. Some came to him, commissioning coats for themselves, paying in goods or cash. Daniel accepted these commissions, for he needed to support himself, but he never let them take priority over the work he did for his own community. His prices were modest, far lower than what he could have charged. Wealth still held no interest for him. What interested him was the work itself, continual refinement of his technique, the quiet satisfaction of creating something that genuinely improved people's lives. By 30, he had developed a complete system of cold minus weather clothing. Not just a coat, but a coordinated layering system, an inner layer to wick moisture from the skin, a middle layer to trap heat, an outer layer to block wind and snow. He designed gloves with removable liners, allowing for fine work without fully exposing the hands. He made boot liners that could be dried and changed daily, extending the life of the boots themselves. He designed hoods for children that protected the face while still letting them see and hear. Each innovation was small, that together they represented a significant advance over traditional frontier garments. The winter of isolation, as it came to be called locally, arrived when Daniel was 13-7. Massive storm system settled over the region in early November and refused to lift. Snow fell for days, then weeks. Temperatures plunged to depths even the oldest residents could not remember. The settlement was completely cut off. Trails impassable. The frozen creek buried under drifts taller than a man. It was then that Daniel's decades of work truly proved their worth. The clothing systems he had developed and shared kept people alive. Families that might have suffered catastrophic clothing failure found their garments, many made or mended by Daniel, held under extreme stress. But problems arose. The unprecedented, sustained cold meant even good garments wore faster than expected. Seams under constant strain began to fail. Furs that should have lasted a season thinned by mid-December. And the isolation meant no supplies were getting in. No new materials to be had. Daniel found himself working 16, 18 hours a day. Moving from dwelling to dwelling with his sewing kit, performing emergency repairs by firelight. His fingers bled from the constant work. His eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. He ate and slept little, driven by a quiet desperation, not for himself, but for the community that depended on the integrity of their clothing. In moments during that winter, he doubted whether it would be enough, whether his efforts could truly hold against such severe cold. He would sit by someone else's hearth mending a coat, the owner sleeping nearby, and feel the weight of responsibility. If this coat failed, if his repair did not hold, some might die. It was a heavy burden, made heavier by the knowledge he had taken it on voluntarily. No one had asked him to do this. But there was a peculiar peace in the work as well. The repetitive motion of needle through cloth, the transformation of something broken toward wholeness, the simple act of doing what one could, with what one had. These things created a meditation, a quiet spaced out could not quite reach. By the time the storms finally broke in late January, Daniel had mended or reinforced garments for almost every family in the settlement. His own coat, by comparison, was in tatters. He had repeatedly cannibalized it, taking patches from his own garments to mend others, until what remained was barely functional. He shivered constantly that winter, his hands trembling with cold and fatigue, but he considered it a fair trade. When spring came and people tallied their survival, several families came to Daniel's dwelling. They found him asleep by his fire, his sewing kit still on his knees, surrounded by scraps of cloth and fur. They let him sleep, and while he slept, they made him a new coat. Not one person, but a collective effort. Everyone contributed a piece of fur, a scrap of felt, their best thread, their most careful stitches. And Daniel woke, the coat hung by his door. No one told him who had made it. It was simply there, a gift from the community. Anonymous, unconditional. Daniel wore that coat for 15 years. It was the best garment he ever owned, not because of its materials, they were good, but not extraordinary, but because of what it represented. A tangible expression of mutual survival. A community that had learned to care for itself by learning to care for each other. As he grew older, Daniel trained others. Not formally, not in a master-apprentice manner, but simply by letting people watch him work, by answering questions, by freely sharing his techniques. He was particularly patient with the young, understanding that the knowledge he had accumulated would die with him unless passed on. We taught them not just how to mend, but how to see clothing as a system, how to anticipate problems before they became critical, how to innovate, not just replicate. In his 50s, Daniel's hands grew twisted with arthritis. Decades of fine work had taken their toll on his joints. His eyesight worsened, making detailed work difficult. He could no longer produce the exquisite stitches he had once taken pride in, but he continued to offer advice, to teach, to share his knowledge with anyone who asked. He became a living repository of know-how, sought out by people from neighboring settlements who had heard of his expertise. Daniel died in a mild winter when he was 60-2. He was sitting by his fire, a half-mended garment in his lap. and he simply closed his eyes and did not open them again. By frontier standards, it was a peaceful death, without violence or prolonged suffering. The settlement buried him in the small cemetery on the hill. People left small offerings on his grave, scraps of fur, needles, thread, the tools of his trade. His name was not recorded in any official history. No government commendation honored him. No chronicle mentioned his contributions. That in the settlement and the surrounding area, his name was remembered, passed down through generations, not as a legend, but as a fact. Daniel Vasilevich, the coat minus maker, the man who saved lives, who showed that survival was not just about enduring, but about helping others endure. His hybrid coat design continued to be made long after his death. Its spread gradually through the region, became so common people forgot it had ever been an innovation. It simply became the way coats were made, a standard by which all others were measured, and that forgettingly a kind of perfect success. The work had become so integrated, so natural, and no longer needed attribution. It was just how things were done, hand to hand, generation to generation. A legacy of warmth in a cold world. Daniel's life was not dramatic. He conquered no territory, accumulated no fortune, gained no fame beyond his small world. But he did something perhaps more meaningful. He found problem, applied himself to solving it, and in the process, tangibly improved the lives of those around him. His ambition had been modest, to be warm, to help others be warm, to see another winner through it. And in pursuing that modest ambition with patient focus over decades, he achieved something no amount of wealth or fame could match. He mattered, profoundly and permanently, to ordinary people struggling in an impossible environment. The cult that hangs in the small museum of frontier life in that region, if you could find it, would seem unremarkable to modern eyes. It is patched, worn in places, the fur matted in spots. The stitching stands out like thick ridges. But if you look closely, if you understand what you are seeing, you will notice the precise angles of the stitches, the innovative way the materials are layered, the careful reinforcement of stress points. You will see, preserved in cloth and fur, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime devoted to the quiet service of survival. You would understand that this coat, and the thousands like it made by people Daniel taught or inspired, represent something essential about human adaptation. Not grand gestures or dramatic innovations, but the patient, incremental improvements of ordinary people doing the best they could with what they had. As decades passed, the settlement grew into a small town. The town eventually connected to the wider world by roads and telegraph. The conditions that shaped Daniel's life gradually changed. Machine-made clothing became available, shipped from distant factories. Winters, are still severe, became less immediately life-threatening as technology advanced and infrastructure improved. The specific skills Daniel developed became less necessary, eventually relegated to historical curiosity, but the principles remained. Survival in harsh conditions required more than just toughness. It required thoughtfulness. More than endurance, it required innovation. More than individual strength, it required community cooperation. Daniel had embodied these principles without ever articulating them. He had lived them so thoroughly they were inseparable from his identity. And in doing so, he left a mark deeper than fame, while lasting than wealth. A mark written in lives saved, in cold endured, in mornings faced because clothing was adequate, and therefore in hope made sufficient. His story, told here in quiet tones as you drift toward sleep, is not meant to inspire dramatic action or grand ambition. It is merely to remind you, meaning often resides in the small, patient actions repeated over time. The most profound human achievements are sometimes those no one writes down. And in the end, the measure of a life well-lived may be as simple as this. Did others feel warmer because you were there? Let his memory rest quietly in your mind as we turn now to other explorations, to other quiet corners of forgotten history, where ordinary people did extraordinary things by refusing to give up, by learning from those around them. and by caring enough to share what they had learned with anyone in need. In the archives of a regional museum in eastern Siberia is preserved a collection few ever see. It consists of some 24 garments recovered over the past century from various sites. Archaeological digs, abandoned settlements, collapsed dwellings, burials exposed by erosion or the chance of construction. The objects are fragile now. Despite modern preservation methods, they are slowly decomposing even in their climate-controlled, protective storage. What makes the collection compelling is not the garments themselves unremarkable at first glance, but the questions they raise, questions that remain mostly unanswered even after decades of study. The museum building itself is plain, a converted Soviet Minas-Sera administrative block. Corridors are hung with photographs of expeditions, maps marking archaeological sites. The storage room holding the garments is kept at a constant temperature just above freezing. Humidity is monitored hourly, adjusted by machines that hum a mechanical lullaby to artifacts that have slept for centuries. The first mystery concerns surface storage pits. At 17 sites across the region, archaeologists have discovered pits, carefully constructed, dug deep into the permafrost, and with birch bark, sealed with layers of moss and clay. Inside these pits, wrapped in yet more bark and occasionally what seems like oily leather, are bundles of fur fragments. Not complete garments, but pieces, some as small as a palm, some as large as a cloak. The preservation varies wildly. Some are pristine, the first supple, the leather lining soft as if placed months, not generations ago. Others degrade at a touch, crumbling to dust when exposed to air and light. A molecular structure so damaged by time they can barely be held together for photography and cataloging. What unites them is their deliberate placement. The careful racking. You can intend to preserve them for future use or for some purpose we can no longer comprehend. A gentle, unanswered question hangs over the collection. Why bury clothing in permafrost? The practical explanation is storage. These were valuable materials, kept frozen to prevent rot, preserved until needed. The explanation is logical, yet incomplete. Digging these pits represented significant labor, especially in frozen ground. The wrapping and sealing process was meticulous, time-consuming. It suggests something more than simple storage, something more ritualistic, more deliberate. Some researchers propose they were emergency caches, supplies hidden against catastrophic need, a fire that destroyed a settlement, a winter so harsh it exhausted all other resources, a forced migration that left no time to gather belongings. Others think they were great good, intended to accompany the dead to an afterlife as people understood it, though no human remains have been directly associated with the pits. Still others point to the possibility of trade goods, furs prepared for eventual exchange, but never retrieved. A trader dying en route, a route becoming too dangerous, a market collapsing before the trade could occur. Each theory has merit, not fully explained the evidence. The distribution of the pits is itself peculiar, scattered over hundreds of kilometers with no obvious pattern. Some clustered near river crossings, others isolated in forests far from known settlements. The effort required to build them suggests they were important. Their concealment suggests they were secret, or at least private, not meant for common knowledge or casual access. At one site, archaeologists found 3 pits within 3 meters of each other. All contained similar materials, but sealed at different times. The birch bark in each showed different degrees of decay, suggesting the pits were used decades apart. This implied someone returned to the specific spot repeatedly over a lifetime. Lore and knowledge of the site was passed down, each generation added to this hidden hoard for reasons that died with them. The mystery deepens with the examination of needles found at numerous frontier sites. They are made of bone, usually brit bone-like and strand, carved with astonishing fineness. The eyes are perfectly round, drilled with a precision that seems impossible with the tools presumably available. Each is so smooth, so regular, it suggests hours of patient labor. You find real bit of harder bone or stone, slowly rotated. The hole gradually widened while maintaining perfect circularity. But more captivating is the decoration. Many needles are incised with spiral patterns, tiny grooves winding regularly from point to eye. These spirals serve no obvious practical purpose. They do not improve the needle's performance, do not make it easier to grip or thread. In fact, by creating stress points in the bone, they might slightly weaken it, yet they recur across different sites, from different periods. Their consistency suggests they had meaning. Their variety suggests they were not mass produced. Some needles are patterned with dots instead of spirals. Small round indentations arranged in rows or clusters, spaced with precision, as if measured against an invisible grid. Some have cross-hatching. Some have lines radiating from the eye, like a sun. The diversity is fascinating, but so is the underlying consistency. Almost every needle found in a frontier settlement context bears some kind of decoration, from simple scratch lines to complex geometric patterns that must have taken days to complete. Modern needles, by contrast, are purely functional, unmarked, anonymous, made by the thousands, with no thought to individual identity or aesthetics. These decorated needles suggest that sewing, perhaps the tools of sewing, held meaning beyond the purely practical. Were the spirals protective symbols, intended to ward off bad luck for the user or to bless the garments they made? Were they marks of ownership? In a communal living situation where personal possessions were indented in tools precious enough to need careful tracking, to mark which needle belonged to whom, or were they simply artistic expression, a small pleasure of making something beautiful in a world often harsh and utilitarian, where opportunities for creativity were bounded by survival needs? We cannot know. The people who carved these needles left no written explanation of their choices. Oral traditions that might have preserved this knowledge have long since dissipated. To loss to population shifts, cultural change, the arrival of new belief systems that supplanted the old, and the simple erosion of memory across generations, we are left only with the objects themselves, beautiful, unmysterious, whispering across the centuries in a language we can no longer fully comprehend. Their surfaces are polished smooth, by hands we will never know. Their use is partly visible, but never fully revealed. Some needles show clear signs of long use, the bone polished by friction, the point worn blunt and sharpened many times, giving the shaft a slight bend. Its peaks of years of threading, of pulling through tough material. These were treasured possessions, maintained over a lifetime, perhaps passed from parent to child, each generation adding its microscopic contribution to the patina of use. Other needles look often used, the decoration still sharp and clear, suggesting they were special purpose items, or perhaps never truly used for sewing at all, but kept for symbolic reasons we cannot fathom. Another oddity emerges from fabric analysis of recovered garments. Modern microscopy and chemical tests show that many garments contain layers of certain grease deep within the fibers, not on the surface, where normal wear would put it, but throughout the material. This indicates the fabrics were intentionally treated, systematically, but repeatedly exposed to smoke and grease, hung over fires for long periods, or rubbed with melted fat until the material was saturated. The practical benefits of such treatment are obvious. Compounds in smoke repel insects, inhibit mold, prolonging the life of organic materials that in the brief summer thaw could become food for beetles, or a substrate for fungus. Grease waterproofs fabric, keeps leather supple, prevents extreme cold from making untreated materials brittle. That the degree of impregnation found in these garments goes beyond what would result from incidental exposure or occasional, simple maintenance. These textiles were repeatedly drenched in smoke and grease until they were almost stiff. The fibers swelled and darkened, their original color obscured by the treatment layer, altering their very nature. The process would have been deliberate, time-consuming, requiring fires maintained at specific temperatures for hours, even days, careful collection and melting of fat, application in multiple sessions. It would have left the garments with a strong, distinctive odor. Not necessarily unpleasant, but pronounced. a mix of wood, smoke, and rendered animal fat that would have clung to the wearer, announcing their presence before they entered sight. That scent would have been intimate and constant, a personal atmosphere accompanying each person through their days, as distinctive as appearance or voice. Was this purely practical? The preservation technique that happened also to improve the garment's weather resistance to the level necessary for survival under extreme conditions. Or was there a symbolic component? A belief that smoke held protective properties beyond the chemical. That fact contains some essence of the animal that could be transferred to the fabric and thus to the wearer. In some Siberian indigenous traditions, smoke is seen as a purifying agent that drives away bad spirits or ill fortune. Its upward movement is seen as carrying prayers or intentions skyward to the realm where powerful forces controlling fate reside. Fat from an animal might be seen as containing the animal's strength or warmth, its essence captured in the rendered substance, transferable through proximity and absorption. But these are speculations. The inference is based on observations of related cultures from later periods or different areas, not direct evidence from the people who actually performed these treatments. The settlers who treated their garments this way left no explanations. We can only wonder where the line between practical necessity and spiritual belief lay, where function ended and ritual began, or whether, in minds shaped by a different worldview, such a distinction even existed. The chemical signatures in the treated fabrics show interesting variation. Some were primarily exposed to birch smoke, some to pine, some to a mix, possibly indicating seasonal or regional differences in available wood. The fats likewise vary, some clearly from marine mammals like seal, others from land animals like reindeer or elk, suggesting either regional variation based on available resources or perhaps deliberate choice based on beliefs about the properties of fat from different animals. Perhaps the most mysterious find is the oversized gloves. On 3 separate excavations, archaeologists have recovered gloves that are, by any reasonable standard, too large to be functional. They are enormous, 3 or 4 times the size of a normal hand. Made with the same careful stitching as regular gloves, but clearly not meant for any known human anatomy to wear practically. It has been suggested these were display items, not for use. Perhaps hung in a dwelling as symbols of warmth or protection, their exaggerated size making them more noticeable, more impressive. Others think they were practice pieces made by apprentices learning the craft, trying techniques on a larger scale before attempting normal minus-sized garments, the bigger dimensions allowing easier manipulation and clearer visibility of technique. But neither explanation fits the evidence perfectly. The gloves were found in domestic contexts, not in ritual spaces or teaching areas. They were mixed in with normal household goods, not set apart as special items, and they show signs of wear, scuffing on the palms, stress at the seams, indicating they were used, perhaps in ways we do not understand. The surfaces bear the marks of friction and pressure that come from actual handling, not passive storage. A tentative, unprobable theory is that they were used in winter festivals or rituals, perhaps as part of a costume worn over normal gloves. Their absurd proportions creating a comic or a minus-inspiring effect depending on the context. Winters on the frontier were not just physically harsh, they were psychologically challenging. The endless dark, the confinement of the cold season created conditions where social cohesion could fray, where individual spirits could break under the weight of monotony and isolation. It is reasonable that societies would develop rituals to break the monotony, to create communal moments that provided psychological relief as necessary as physical shelter. The giant gloves could have been comic props in a performance or game, their clumsy size creating laughter through absurdity, the kind of humor that binds a community through shared delight in the ridiculous. Or, they may have had practical uses we have not considered, perhaps as protective sheaths, for some to lure item being transported or stored, perhaps as containers for transporting fragile items in extreme cold, the thick padding and sealed structure providing insulation for delicate objects. One glove interior had stains consistent with plant material, suggesting it may have held seeds or dried herbs, though why such items would require such elaborate protection is unclear. The truth is, we do not know. The gloves remain curiosities, carefully stored in museum drawers, resisting all attempts at definitive explanation. They stand as witnesses to effort whose purpose has evaporated with time. Every time a curator shows them to a visitor, the same questions arise, the same speculations are offered, the same uncertainty remains. The objects stubbornly refuse to yield their secrets, despite all scrutiny. The influence of indigenous techniques on settler clothing is well-documented but not fully understood. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of cross-cultural borrowing, Russian-style coats with Nenets-style construction, traditional felt boots with indigenous-style furliners, hybrid garments combining elements from both traditions in ways that suggest experimentation and adaptation, not simple copying. But the details of this exchange remain murky, filtered through incomplete records and physical evidence that shows the result, not the process. Did settlers learn through direct instruction, sitting with indigenous craftsmen, being explicitly taught techniques, relationships formed through trade, intermarriage, or simple proximity that allowed knowledge to pass? Or was it learned through observation, examining garments, trying to replicate what was seen, reverse-engineering solutions to problems shared despite cultural difference? With their resistance to this borrowing, social tension around adopting foreign methods, pride wounded by the implicit admission that others possessed superior knowledge, or doubt that techniques developed in one context could be transplanted to another, or was it simply pragmatic? Recognizing that certain techniques worked better under these conditions, and when cold could be fatal, questions of tradition became secondary to questions of effectiveness. The historical record gives us clues, not answers. Traders' diaries mention settlers seeking advice from indigenous people on cold weather gear. Briefly note the exchange of furs or tools that accompany the information. There are mentions of indigenous women being hired or bartering their skills, working in settler households, or taking custom orders for their expertise even as broader power dynamics remained unequal and exploitative. But these are fragments. Brief notes and documents focused on other concerns: trade ledgers, travel routes, political maneuvering, not detailed ethnographic accounts that might capture the human texture of these interactions. When no exchange happened, the physical evidence in the garments themselves proves it. Stitching patterns and material choices show clear influence across cultural boundaries. But the human dimension, the negotiations, the relationships, the possible conflicts that shaped it remains largely invisible, occurring in spaces and moments deemed too ordinary, too marginal to what the record keepers considered important, and thus unworthy of recording. We can see a Russian coat with a Nenets-style hood, but we cannot see the conversation that led to that modification, cannot hear the explanation given, the questions asked, cannot know if this was a moment of mutual respect or a transaction colored by inequality and need. The Nenets a design with its hood and careful attention to directional fur placement, ensuring water ran off rather than soaked in, appears throughout frontier settlements in modified form. In fact, each community seems to have adopted it slightly differently. Some versions of longer hands, extending protection further down the body at the cost of mobility and material. Some have additional closures at the waist, allowing the wearer to seal the garment more tightly or open it for ventilation as conditions changed. Some combine felt panels in areas where only fur was used originally, perhaps because felt was more readily available, or because experience showed it performed better under specific conditions. This variation suggests the design was not simply copied wholesale, but was understood, analyzed, and consciously modified to suit different needs, preferences, or available materials. That process of understanding and modification implies a complex engagement with the technology, not mindless imitation, but thoughtful innovation. People took an idea and made it their own through deliberate changes reflecting their own circumstances and insights. That suggests at least some settlers treated indigenous knowledge with respect, acknowledged the expertise they encountered, and sought genuinely to learn, not merely to exploit, saw these techniques as valuable knowledge, not as inferior substitutes to be ignored or appropriated without acknowledgement. But again, we are reading between the lines. inferring relationships from objects, trying to reconstruct human dynamics from stitching patterns and material choices, building castles of interpretation on the physical evidence that remains silent on the social context. The garments themselves are neutral witnesses. They saw it was done, but now why, by whom, with what thoughts and feelings? The archaeological technique dubbed the windproof seal is perhaps the most debated mystery in the collection. In roughly 40% of recovered garments, researchers found a unique seam construction. It appears a known contemporary Russian or indigenous tradition. Either it was a local innovation, or it was a technique that has been lost even in its culture of origin. The seam is stitched in an overlapping cross-minus stitch, creating layers of thread that interlock, increasing material density at the join. Examined under magnification, its structure resembles scales or roofing shingles. Each segment of thread overlaps the previous, the pattern repeating with astonishing consistency along the seam's length. The theoretical benefit of this construction is superior wind resistance. Hair trying to penetrate the seam is deflected by the overlapping layers, cannot find a straight path through the fabric, is forced into a maze, eventually slows and stops. But making these seams required extraordinary time and precision. Every stitch had to be placed exactly according to a complex pattern, demanded total concentration to maintain the thread's specific angle of entry and exit. Tension had to be perfect throughout, tight enough to create the overlapping effect, but not so tight as to pucker the fabric or create stress points that might tear. And the thread had to be of uniform thickness, requiring careful preparation and selection. For any variation would disrupt the regularity the technique needed to function. I think a seam on a coat could take 10 or 12 hours to complete, compared to 2 or 3 hours for a standard seam using simpler techniques that provided adequate, if not exceptional, protection. The question is, did the technique actually provide meaningful benefit, or was it a complex solution to a misunderstood problem? If I have a fine understanding of how wind and cold penetrated clothing, modern textile science suggests windproofing would indeed improve. Laboratory tests show a measurable reduction in air permeability compared to control seams. Whether that improvement justified the massive increase in labor, however, is debatable. It might depend on context. For someone making a single garment to last for years, the investment might be worth it. For someone needing to produce multiple garments quickly, simpler methods would be more practical. In fact, there is another possibility, mentioned cautiously by researchers, aware of how speculative it sounds and how difficult to prove or disprove. Perhaps these seams were primarily not functional but symbolic. Their complexity and the time required were themselves the point, not the physical properties they produced. Perhaps the time invested in their creation was, in itself, meaningful. A tangible expression of care and protection that went beyond purely material considerations. If you spent 12 hours sewing a seam on your child's coat, did that panic carry a protective power in your mind that a hurriedly made one did not? Did the accumulated hours of focused attention create something beyond cloth and thread? Did the belief that the garment was special translate psychologically into more careful maintenance, more timely repairs, thus actually making it last longer, protect better through the indirect mechanism of increased care? Here we enter territory where archaeology and psychology intersect, where physical evidence leads us to questions about belief and intention that cannot be answered with scientific certainty. The seams exist, their construction is documented, that their meaning is forever ambiguous, suspended between what we can measure and what we can only imagine. Colored thread presents another puzzle. In a small number of garments, threads of bright red and blue appear, sometimes a single stitch, sometimes a short length, sometimes woven into seams in complex patterns, forming small geometric or abstract designs. The threads are dyed, not natural. Dyes would have been expensive, difficult to obtain on the frontier, where most materials had to be sourced locally or hauled over vast distances. Their very presence suggests they were valued, deemed worth the trouble to acquire, and the decision to use them in these specific ways. Quick, why is them unpractical winter clothing, where they would often be covered by other layers, unseen by anyone but the wearer or those who help them dress. The patterns they form do not seem to be decoration in the usual sense. They are too small, placed irregularly, not located where they would draw the eye or contribute to an overall aesthetic effect. Some researchers propose they marked repairs, way of tracking which seams had been reinforced or replaced, a visual history built into the garment structure. Others think they indicated ownership or family affiliation, a kind of subtle signature woven into the fabric, visible to those who knew how to look, but not obvious to the casual observer. Still others see ritual significance, the chosen colors carrying symbolic weight: red for warmth, blood, or life; blue for sky, water, or protection, each hue bearing associations beyond its physical properties. Siberian indigenous cultures did use colors symbolically in their crafts. Each shade carried layers of meaning tied to cosmology and belief systems. The visible spectrum mapped onto spiritual categories, making color choice a significant act, not merely an aesthetic one. The settlers borrowed these symbolic associations along with practical techniques. The colored threads might represent an intent to invoke protection or blessing to the garment itself. Embedded in its structure, not just material durability, but spiritual reinforcement. Color became a vessel for intention, a physical marker of hope or prayer, permanently woven into the fabric that would, like lust to the skin, travel through dangerous cold. But, like so much else, this remains speculation. The threads are there, their existence undeniable, tiny bright lines visible against the darker materials around them. But their meaning has dissolved with time, leaving only the physical trace and our endless wondering. Chemical analysis can tell us what plant created the dye, can trace possible trade routes or sources, but it cannot tell us what the person placing those stitches was thinking. What the color meant to them. Was it ritual, repair, or simply the aesthetic pleasure of adding a spot of brightness to a dark world? Rituals surrounding clothing are documented, though in frustratingly sparse detail. A missionary's diary from the early 19th century mentions, almost in passing, a blessing ceremony at winter's onset. Families brought newly made or mended coats to the largest available dwelling, gathered as the first real cold settled outside. A village elder blessed them. The record is brief, just a few sentences embedded in the missionary's lengthy account of his travels and attempts to convert, and his tone is dismissive. He clearly saw it as a pagan superstition, barely worth noting except as evidence of the spiritual darkness he perceived. And he did not. The elder spoke over each garment and touched them with a burning brand from the community fire, leaving small char marks on the fabric, the smoke rising in tendrils to the roof. Were these char marks protective symbols, physical markers of a blessing intended to confer spiritual protection? Linking the garment to the fire that represented warmth, life, the community's collective survival. A few preserved garments do show small, deliberate char marks, circular, clean minus edged, not the kind of damage an accidental brush with flame would cause. Their placement is too consistent, too careful to be random. These marks are often on the inside of the collar or near the heart, places that would contact the wearer's body but not be seen by others, suggesting their meaning was personal, internal, not social and for display. What do these hidden marks say about beliefs concerning how protection worked? Was it through visible symbols meant to impress others? Through an intangible connection between object and reality that function would graph as of external observation. Another fragmentary account, this from a trader's memoir, published decades after his experiences, and thus possibly colored by time and selective memory, described seeing children's boots hung near a smoke vent at winter's onset. When he inquired about the practice, he was told it was to feed the warm spirits, though his informant seemed reluctant to elaborate, perhaps aware the trader might ridicule such beliefs, or bound by cultural rules against sharing such information with outsiders. The concept of warm spirit entities, or forces associated with heat and protection from cold, appears in various Siberian indigenous traditions. Their specific characteristics vary by culture, but the basic concept recurs across a wide geographic and cultural range. That settlers adopted or adapted these beliefs It would represent a profound cultural borrowing, not just of practical techniques, but of worldview, basic assumptions about how the world worked, what forces governed fate and survival. But again, we have only clues, passing mentions by people not particularly interested in understanding what they saw, recording these observations as curiosities or evidence of superstition, not as data worth careful collection and analysis. Its hunt and smoke, were they being treated for preservation, receiving the same smoke impregnation as other garments? Or was this itself the ritual, a special act distinct in intention and belief from practical maintenance? Perhaps the most poignant find is a child's coat, recovered from a collapsed dwelling. It has a unique band of stitching around its hem, tiny, repeated marks that form no obvious design, but cover the entire lower edge of the garment, about 2 fingers wide. Analysis shows these were done by multiple people. The sewing style differs slightly, variations in tension and elbow, indicating different hands worked on different sections, though all followed the same basic pattern. Several people, perhaps family or community members, each contributed a stretch of stitching to a shared project. The practical purpose is unclear. The stitching does not reinforce a weak area or repaired edge. It seems to add no structural or functional benefit to the coat's performance. It appears purely decorative, or perhaps symbolic, each set of stitches representing something beyond its physical presence. One reading is that this was a communally made garment. Each person's stitches represented their wish for the child's safety and warmth. Their contribution was both practical labor and ritual prayer. In a world of high infant mortality, where winter cold posed a real threat to small bodies, less able to regulate temperature, to generate and retain heat, such a garment might have carried profound meaning, a tangible embodiment of communal protection. Every stitch a prayer or hope sewn into the fabric that would wrap the child's body. But this is interpretation. Our own emotions about childhood vulnerability and communal care projected onto an object that cannot speak for itself. We see the stitches, can analyze the different techniques used, and measure the variations that indicate multiple contributors. Yet, we cannot know what the people making them were thinking or feeling, for words might have been spoken as they worked. What beliefs gave their actions meaning? Whether they saw this as ritual or simply cooperative labor, whether each stitch carried conscious intent, or was just part of a shared effort to make clothing for a community member. The coat is small. The child who wore it could not have been more than 4 or 5. Its presence in a collapsed dwelling suggests either the child outgrew it and it was set aside, or something sadder happened. The hopes of a community's stitches unable to prevent an outcome. Some communities had a whispered tradition of songs sung while processing leather. Leather, especially the thick hide of elk or reindeer, requires extensive processing before it can be sewn. Transforming raw material into something usable is labor minus intensive and time minus consuming. It must be softened. A process involving scraping off the fat and flesh attached to the inner layer, treating it with brains or fat which act as tanning agents through a chemical process not understood but empirically validated, and calling stretching. Kneading it for hours until it grows pliable. The stiff hide gradually relaxes, becomes flexible. The work is physically demanding, mentally numbing in its repetition. The same motions thousands of times. Oral tradition suggests people sang while doing it. Felt to more time, to keep rhythm, and perhaps for other reasons the songs themselves might hint at. A few fragments of these songs recorded by ethnographers are rhythmic, repetitive, the nonsense syllables alternating with occasional mentions of warmth, protection, or the animal whose hide was being worked. The phrases might have been prayers, or simply mnemonic devices, but carried meanings that have since been lost or blurred. Were these work songs merely aids to keeping rhythm in monotonous labor, the human voice creating structure and pattern, making time pass more easily? Or were they closer to incantations, attempts to commune with the spirit of the animal, to thank it for its hide, or to ask that the hide serve its new purpose well? An animist belief systems common among Siberian indigenous peoples and possibly influencing frontier settlers more than official records admit animals possess spirits worthy of respect. Taking an animal's life or using its body creates obligations a responsible person would honor. Using an animal's hide without proper acknowledgement might invite misfortune, upset the balance between humans and the natural world, with consequences that might extend beyond the immediate act. Failing to hide as you worked it could be seen as a way of maintaining that relationship, to ensure the granite need from that hide would function while the animal spirit appeased, honored, or merely acknowledged in a way that seemed necessary and proper, even if the exact causal mechanism remained mysterious. But these are speculations built on fragments, handed down by people 2 or 3 generations removed from the original singers, their meaning possibly lost before anyone thought to record them. Knowledge erodes as old ways give way to new, and as the context that made certain practices meaningful disappears, the recordings we have are scratchy, indistinct, voices often from elderly informants uncertain of the words, sometimes stopping mid-verse because they cannot remember the next line, sometimes continuing with obvious improvisation because the original has slipped away. The blurred line between the practical and the sacred runs through all of this. Western culture tends to draw sharp boundaries between functional objects and ritual objects, between work and worship, the philosophical framework that keeps these categories separate by viewing the material and the spiritual as fundamentally different realms. But frontier life, especially under conditions as harsh as a Siberian winter, may not have permitted such clear categorization, or may have operated under different assumptions where those boundaries did not exist, or were drawn different way. Your clothing is literally the difference between life and death. Insufficient clothing means survival, and insufficient means freezing. When the success of your mending determines whether your child makes it through the season, or falls to the cold seeping through a weak seam, then the act of making and maintaining clothing naturally takes on profound significance beyond the purely practical. Every stitch is both mechanical and freighted with meaning. Thread passing through cloth is both practical technique and an act carrying weight beyond its physical result. Every material choice is both practical and possibly symbolic, chosen for availability and performance, but also perhaps for properties believed to exist beyond what is measurable or testable. Clothing protects your body from the cold, yes, performing its function through the physical properties of insulation and wind-breaking. But perhaps it also protects your spirit from despair, protects your sense of self from the grinding weight of hardship that could break a person as surely as cold could kill. When you put on furs you yourself and sewn with thread you spun, reinforced with stitches you placed with care, you are not just dressing. You are putting on your own labor, your own skill, your own refusal to surrender in an impossible environment, wearing your capability and resolve as tangibly as you wear cloth and fur. And if, beyond these tangible qualities, you also believe the clothing carries blessing or protection from the spirits of the materials themselves, from the animals that provided them, from songs sung over them, or prayers sewn into them, would that belief make the clothing more effective? Perhaps not physically, not in laboratory tests of insulation value or wind resistance, but psychologically, emotionally, in ways that might translate into better maintenance, longer use, greater resilience in the face of hardship that is as much mental as physical. There is no scientific method to measure these things. And no experiment that can isolate the variable of belief. No control group. We are left with the objects, with their mysteries, with our questions that spiral into uncertainty, like the decorative patterns carved into bone needles, leading us somewhere we cannot explicitly follow, but creating beautiful shapes on the way to nowhere. In one of the museum's storage rooms is an exhibit rarely shown to the public. It contains perhaps the collection's greatest mystery, a complete garment, a full -length coat that defies simple categorization, challenges every attempt at straightforward explanation. It appears to be pieced together from dozens, perhaps hundreds of small pieces of different furs, each piece no larger than a playing card, all stitched together in a complex quilted pattern, forming a swirl of colors and textures. The amount of work required to make such a garment is staggering. Done with precision, It could represent months of meticulous labor. Each tiny piece had to be cut precisely, each edge aligned and carefully sewn to its neighbor, ensuring seams would not become points where cold could penetrate, or where wearing stress would cause separation. The result is strangely beautiful, wreck of shifting colors and textures, light catching each furrow differently, making the surface seem to shimmer and move as perspective changes. Some patches are dark, light minus absorbing. Others are light, reflective. The overall effect is more visually complex, more interesting than any single minus for garment, but the practical value is at best questionable. All those seams are potential points of failure. Places where if thread loosens, cold could get in, or where if fabric snags, a tear could start. Structural weakness multiplied by the number of joining S. A design using larger pieces, or ideally single pieces, would be stronger, more durable, and take a fraction of the time to make. The same amount of fur could have made a garment in a small fraction of the time. So, why make it? The label beside it in storage speculates it might have been ceremonial, perhaps worn by a community leader at important gatherings, its complex construction marking it as special, setting the wearer apart from everyday clothing through the obvious investment of time and skill. But there is evidence of wear here. Slight fraying at the cuffs. The hash has contact with ground and snow. The collar has stains consistent with long contact with skin and hair. Someone wore it regularly, used it as a functional garment despite its impractical construction, despite the ongoing risk that anyone at its seams might fail at a critical moment. Another theory is that it was a necessity garment, made in a time when large pieces of fur were not to be had. Someone had to make do with fragments, small remnants salvaged from ruined garments, scraps left over from other projects. Survival demanded every bit of material be used, aesthetic considerations be damned. But if that were the case, one would expect rougher construction, more focus on function over form. Seems adequate but not beautiful. Stitching prioritizing speed and strength over precision and appearance. And this coat, whatever its origins, represents meticulous craft. Time was invested not just to make something functional, but to make something beautiful. Attention was paid to how colors and textures interacted, creating pleasing patterns even as they served a practical need. Perhaps the answer lies there. Someone, for reasons we can no longer learn, chose to create beauty in the midst of hardship, to make something both practical and aesthetically pleasing, both materially significant and deeply meaningful, refusing to let survival be a purely mechanical affair. Perhaps in a life constrained by cold, scarcity, and endless repetition, creating something truly beautiful was itself a form of resistance. A statement that life was more than mere survival, that even in desperate circumstances, humans were worthy of beauty, that the spirit needed nourishment as much as the body. Or perhaps we are reading too much into it, projecting modern romantic notions onto a practical object whose true purpose was plain and obvious to its maker, but has been lost to time. The context that would explain everything has evaporated, and the object remains. The frustration of archaeology lies here. We have objects, but not context, physical evidence, but not the human stories that gave that evidence meaning, and results, but not processes, answers, but no questions. We can measure, analyze, theorize, apply every tool modern science provides. But we cannot ask the people who made these things what they were thinking, what their choices meant to them, what beliefs, needs, or desires shaped their actions. But they would say if they could see us, centuries later, puzzling over their work. And so we are left with mysteries, with objects that whisper across the centuries, but never speak clearly enough to be fully understood. Their meaning is forever partial, forever filtered through our own assumptions and limitations. The museum's collection includes several children's garments, besides the communally stitched coat. These raise their own questions about childhood on the frontier. The garments are miniatures of adult clothing, made with the same techniques, scaled to small buys. Proof that children work clothed as carefully as adults. their survival equally dependent on adequate protection. Some show modifications for a child's needs, knees reinforced for crawling or place leaves and hems made extra long, suggesting they were made to be grown into, not constantly replaced. A tiny coat intended for an infant has all surfaces for myosin, creating a completely soft environment for delicate skin, insulating without roughness, warming without chafing. The work required to make it reversing the normal orientation and handling the technical challenges that resulted speaks of care for the smallest, most vulnerable. Effort invested beyond mere survival. These garments, perhaps more than any others in the collection, carry emotional weight for a modern viewer. A reminder that behind the abstractions of archaeology were real children, individuals who played, who grew. Those parents clothed them with whatever combination of skill and love and desperation their circumstances allowed. The patterns of mending visible across many garments, how less mysterious, are still noteworthy. Examination under magnification reveals that most garments were ended many times. Patches added seems reinforced, we carry as result. Garments kept in service, their original lifespan extended through continual intervention. Some patches are careful, integrated, almost indistinguishable from the original construction. Others are crude, obvious, suggesting emergency repairs done under duress. The variety of patching materials is also striking. Some patches are clearly of the original material, carefully saved scraps measuring damage in a matching way. Others are improvisations, whatever was at hand, regardless of whether it was a perfect fit. One coat shows evidence of 7 distinct mending episodes, each using different materials and techniques. Its surface becomes an archaeological record of its own history, each intervention visible as a layer in the garment's biography. This pattern of continual mending reflects material scarcity. The difficulty of replacement made maintenance critical. Each garment was kept functional by whatever means available for as long as possible. It also reflects skill, the knowledge required to assess damage and implement a repair that would hold. The technical ability to prevent a small problem from becoming a catastrophic failure. So perhaps it also reflects something else. Attachment to a particular item, reluctance to discard something that had served well. A relationship between person and garment that made replacement feel wrong, even if objectively worse. A preference for the familiar cult over the new. The museum's conservation work faces ongoing challenges. Despite controlled environments, the garments continue to deteriorate. Organic materials decompose through processes that can be slowed, but not stopped. Time takes its due, however carefully we try to preserve. Every time a curator handles a garment for study or display, microscopic amounts of material are lost, fibers shed. The act of observation is itself, in a tiny way, destructive. Photography captures details before they vanish. 3D scanning creates digital records that will outlast the physical objects. That these are surrogates, information about the objects, not the objects themselves. The tension between preservation and access troubles museum staff. These objects have information to share, details that might help answer questions or raise new ones. But examination accelerates their destruction. Every revelation is purchased at the cost of the object's integrity. Some items are too fragile for any handling, stored in sealed containers under inert gas. Their survival prioritized over research. Mysteries effectively locked away to prevent total loss. The museum's director speaks of the collection with a mix of pride and melancholy, aware that she oversees objects both precious and doomed. That despite her best efforts, their slow dissolution is inevitable. She describes the surreal experience of documenting loss, recording degradation each season, watching garments she has cared for over years gradually fade into nothing. Fragments that survived centuries in permafrost decaying under her careful custodiness, because the environment she can create cannot match the accidental preservation of the frozen ground. Beyond the physical garments, the collection includes tools and materials related to clothing production, scrapers for processing hides, awls for punching holes, bone knives for cutting, bundles of sinew thread preserved in their original birch bark containers. These items fail in the process, so not just the final product, but the means of production, the technology that transformed raw materials into finished garments. Some tools show extensive use, working surfaces polished smooth by repetition, signs of maintenance and repair, suggesting they were valuable possessions, kept functional over long periods. Others look almost unused, as still sharp surfaces unmarked, suggesting they were made and then set aside, perhaps as backups, perhaps for someone who never needed them, circumstances changing before the tool found its purpose. The presence of scrapers in many different sizes and shapes hints at specialization. Different tools for different materials or stages of processing. A complex toolkit reflecting accumulated knowledge about how to work efficiently. Teaching must have occurred to knowledge passed from experience to novice. Techniques demonstrated and practiced until they became automatic. Competence built through repetition, correction, gradual mastery. But we have no record of this teaching. No writing describing how skills were transmitted. Through formal apprenticeship or casual observation, were learners children or adults? Did gender determine who learned which skills, or did necessity override such social structures? The tools exist as silent evidence of capability, that the human relationships that sustained and transmitted the capability remain invisible. In recent years, the museum has begun working with members of indigenous communities and historical reminiscent actors, trying experimental archaeology, actually using these techniques to make garments, testing hypotheses about how things were done, what challenges makers faced. These experiments have yielded surprising insight. Techniques that seemed straightforward in description proved devilishly difficult in practice, required skills that took months to develop, physical strength or endurance modern bodies often lacked. These looked simple, and an artifact revealed itself in practice as the product of deep expertise. Dozens of micro-minus decisions and adjustments invisible in the final result, but crucial to success. Brain-minus and actors speak with new respect for the people who made these garments. Their attempts at replication revealed how much skill was hidden in seemingly simple objects, and how much knowledge had to be mastered to produce items that performed reliably under extreme conditions. One participant described spending 40 hours tanning a single hide, following traditional methods. The result was still inferior to archaeological samples. His respect for ancient expertise grew with every weary hour of work. These experimental projects also reveal how much we still do not know. Techniques we thought we understood turned out to rely on details knowing that with recording. Failures prompted researchers to go back to the artifacts, looking for clues they had missed. Attempts at physical replication exposed gaps in our theoretical understanding. The past refuses to yield its secrets easily, despite our best efforts. Regional variations in the collection suggest different communities developed unique solutions to common problems. Local innovations that spread or remained isolated depending on contact patterns and terrain. Northern settlements show more seal fur and marine mammal leather. Their garments reflect coastal access and the materials it provided. Inland settlements relied more on forest animals. Their garments favored elk and reindeer, with occasional fox or bear. Resources dictated by ecosystem, not preference. But within these broad patterns, specific details differ. A favored seam technique in one settlement is different from another. Enclosure systems show community-minus specific variations. Decorative elements cluster in ways that suggest local traditions, or perhaps the influence of a particularly skilled individual whose innovations were copied by neighbors. Mapping these differences paints a picture of cultural diversity, even within the broader category of frontier settlers. Different communities maintained their own identities through material choices and technical preferences, a practical boundary that might have been invisible in other aspects of life, but is clear in clothing construction. Trade networks become visible through these variations. Exotic materials appear far from their source. Techniques spread along travel routes. Innovations diffuse through connected communities, while isolated ones remain unaware. In this sense, the collection is a snapshot of social complexity, patterns of connection and separation, a map of who knew whom, who traded with whom, written in needle and thread, recoverable through careful analysis, even in the absence of written records or direct testimony. As you chef deeper towards Fabe, Reth is the street sound jet in your mind. The decorated needles, the colored threads, the oversized gloves, the songs that might have been prayers, the garments that were more than cloth, all represent the complexity of human life, how practical necessity and spiritual meaning can intertwine, how even the most basic acts of survival can carry layers of significance we can barely perceive. The people who live these lives, made these objects, developed these techniques, performed these rituals, they are gone. Their voices silent, their faces unknown, their individual personalities, dreams, and fears lost to the vast gulf of time that separates us, but the traces they left remain. In permafrosts and museum collections, fragmentary and incomplete, but present, real, and still capable of teaching us if we approach with patience and humility. They remind us that humans have always reached beyond their circumstances, that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to create meaning, to invest care in their labor, to cross boundaries between the material and the spiritual in their search for protection and hope. The frontier was brutal. Survival was hard. Death was common. But within those limits, people still found ways to be human in the fullest sense. Creative, social, spiritual, looking after each other and caring for the next generation, maintaining traditions and innovating new solutions, balancing practical need with symbolic significance, making life bearable, and sometimes even beautiful. Let their mysteries be a comfort to you in your rest, a reminder that not everything needs to be explained or understood, that sometimes the questions themselves are more valuable than any answers we might construct. The decorated needle is beautiful without needing to reveal its purpose. Its spirals carved with care, whether we comprehend their meaning or not. The colored thread is significant without needing to explain itself. Its bright presence and dark fabric carries weight, whether we can interpret its message or not. The child's coat with its communal stitching touches something in us, whether we can prove those stitches were prayers or not. The care evident in each reminds us that love and protection are not modern inventions. They are ancient constants, expressed through whatever means each culture and time provides. They existed, these objects, and the people who made them. They were made with care, and they have lasted long enough to cross centuries to reach us, carrying their questions and mysteries like precious cargo delivered to descendants who never knew them, but who can still, in the careful stitches and deliberate choices, recognize something fundamentally familiar in their humanity. That is enough. The objects rest in their climate minus controlled darkness, slowly yielding to time despite our efforts. But for now they remain testaments to lives lived on the edge of endurance, through hard -1, carefully applied skill, to the human urge to protect and preserve and create meaning even when the environment adjusts. Survival itself should consume all energy and attention. They deserve our attention, our careful study, our willingness to live with uncertainty, to resist the impulse to conclude too soon. They deserve to keep their mysteries, at least some of them, remain partly unknown, despite our scrutiny, reminding us that the past is indeed another country, that the thoughts and beliefs of the people who lived there we can never fully recover. Even when evidence remains, that understanding has its limits. Perhaps it is in this partial knowing, this respectful uncertainty, that we come closest to those who made these things, acknowledging both their humanity and their otherness, recognizing them as kind across time, while accepting that their specific experiences and beliefs remain in important ways beyond our reach. Now sleep. Let the mysteries sleep with you, the spirals and the colored threads, the songs and the stitches. The endless patient labor of people you will never meet, but whose work you can still touch across glass, across centuries, their hands reaching forward through time with a gift we are still learning how to receive. In the town of Yakutsk, some 300 kilometers from the fanning of our quiet journey, life moves to a different rhythm. By the standards of European Russia, the town is not large, but on the Siberian frontier, it represents something approaching civilization. Proper wooden buildings on proper foundations, streets swept regularly of snow, a small garrison of soldiers, A few merchants, administrative officials sent from a distant capital to oversee taxation and maintain order. In this town, winter is still winter, the same brutal cold, the same darkness, the same wind that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. But for those at wealth and status, the experience of winter, the daily texture of it, is fundamentally different. Imagine the morning of a merchant named Pyotr Andreevich Ursakolov, a man who has made his fortune in the fruit trade and maintains a large household in the better part of town. His dwelling is not a semi-minus subterranean's Emilia nka, but a proper to minus story structure of well-minus fitted logs, chinked with moss and clay, sealed with pitch against drafts. Inside, a large ceramic stove dominates the main room, its mass slowly releasing heat accumulated from the previous night's fire. The merchant does not wake in darkness. Feeling the knife-edge of cold stab his nostrils, his breath frosting instantly, he wakes in a room that is cool. Yes, but not dangerously so. Embers still glow in the stove. The household servant has already been up, adding wood, or kindling the fire before the master awoke. By the time Pyotr Andreevich opens his eyes, the room is warmed. Light from the growing fire casts soft shadows on walls hung with insulating tapestries. His clothing is not stiff with frost. It has been stored indoors, near warmth. He does not need to fire his garments before putting them on. A servant brings them to him already warmed and helps him dress. This service may seem mere luxury, but it has practical implications for the preservation of the clothing itself. When garments are handled carefully, not subjected to the strain of being pulled on by cold, stiff hands, when they are stored properly and maintained by someone whose job includes attention to such details, they last longer, perform better, provide more reliable protection. Pyotr's inner layer is linen, but fine, evenly woven, soft to the touch. Hotter than the woolen tunic, dyed a deep blue. The dye itself is a mark of wealth, for it must have been imported at considerable cost. The quality of the wool is also superior to what the average settler can access. Wool from sheep bred for finer fiber, processed by skilled workers who can cotton spin it into relatively smooth yarn. The difference may seem slight, but the cumulative effect is significant. Less itching, less irritation, less distraction from discomfort. His coat, his shab is, by frontier standards, superb. It is made of fox fur, not a patchwork of many animals, but matched pelts selected for uniformity of color and quality. The lining is quilted silk imported along the tea road from China, providing a smooth inner layer that also traps additional warmth. The coat is heavy. Fox fur is dense by nature, but the weight is well distributed. The cut is tailored by a professional who understands how a garment should hang and move. The collar is trimmed with darker fur, possibly sable. The closures are carved bone buttons, not simple ties or toggles. The cost of this coat exceeds the annual income of many settlers. He represents not just warmth, but status, the visible proclamation of prosperity and position. And it works. Piotr can venture out in temperatures that would send a poorly clad person scurrying for shelter, and he can do so in relative comfort, confident his clothing will not fail him. His boots are equally impressive. Made by a cobbler who specializes in boots, using properly done leather dyed black, the soles are thick, built up from layers of leather, treated with pint are for waterproofing and durability. Inside, they are lined with Felton's soft habit fur, creating a warm environment for his feet. He wears woolen socks, and over the boots can go leather overshoes lined with additional felt, giving him multiple layers of protection against snow and cold. His feet will still grow cold after prolonged exposure, but not dangerously so, not with the speed and severity of a settler in crude val enki or bark overshoes. His gloves are kid leather, but are soft, fitted to his hand, lined with rabbit fur, designed to allow relatively fine motor control. He can wear heavier mittens over them when necessary, but often the gloves themselves suffice. for he is not engaged in the kind of heavy labor that requires the more protective, as dexterous gloves workers rely on. Even his scarf is a token of privilege, woven wool, with patterns that require skill and time to create. It's sometimes imported from more settled areas where artisans have such skills, dyed in ways that indicate taste and expense. He owns several scarves, rotates them as needed, ensuring each has adequate time to dry properly between uses. This may seem a trivial detail, but moisture management in winter clothing is critical. Having enough clothing to allow for proper drying is a luxury that greatly increases comfort and garment longevity. Hyatra's dressing process takes perhaps 15 minutes, assisted by a servant. When finished, he is swaddled in layers representing the accumulated expertise of multiple craftsmen: the tanner who prepared the leather, the tailor who cut and sewed his shabe, the weaver who made his scarf, the cobbler who fashioned his boots. Each of these specialists was paid for their labor, their compensation reflecting skill and scarcity. The cost of the merchant's winter wardrobe, if calculated, would exceed the total value of everything a settler family owned: dwelling, tools, clothing, food stores, everything. If disparity is not hidden or denied, it is simply how things are, accepted by all as natural and inevitable as the cold itself. When Pietro goes outside, he experiences a different winter than the settler. He walks on maintained streets, snow regularly cleared by workers hired for the purpose. He walks only short distances from his dwelling to a warehouse or to another merchant's or official's home, minimizing time exposed to the elements. When he needs to travel longer distances, he can use a horse-drawn flag, enclosed, frun-lined, pulled by well-fed, well-untamed animals because they are valuable assets. In the sleigh, wrapped in additional furs, he can reverse kilometers in relative comfort, arriving at his destination cold, perhaps, but not dangerously so. Not exhausted, not shaking uncontrollably. Yakutsk's perhaps a dozen families of comparable wealth, merchants, senior administrative officials, the garrison commander, others who have accumulated resources through trade, appointment, or inheritance. These families form a small society within the larger settlement, interacting mainly with each other, maintaining standards of dress and behavior that set them apart from the common folk. Their winter gatherings are held in heated rooms, lit by candles or oil lamps instead of the dim glow of a single hearth fire. They serve tea imported from China, figs distilled from grain the settler can barely afford to eat, sweetmeats and delicacies that speak of wealth and supply lines. At these gatherings, clothing serves a dual-function: warmth and display. The quality of one's shabe, the fineness of one's boots, an imported silk scarf, jewelry worn, even in winter, all convey status, success, taste. Social rank is written in fur and fabric, legible to anyone who knows how to read. A merchant's wife might wear a coat trimmed with sable, the most precious fur of Siberia, dark, glossy, impossibly expensive. The coat itself will be cut to flatter her figure, not just to provide maximum warmth, varying with darts and seams creating shape, even under the bulk of winter wear. Her hood would be lined with softer fur, perhaps Arctic fox, white and delicate, framing her face. Her gloves might be embroidered with silk thread, patterns requiring hours of painstaking work, too delicate for real labor, but perfect for the short distances between heated spaces. These garments are not made by the wearer. They are commissioned from specialist tailors who have workshops in the town. They employ assistants and apprentices. They have access to imported materials and tools the settler never sees. The relationship between client and tailor is commercial, but also personal. The good tailor understands not just measurements but preferences, understands how to balance fashion with function, how to create garments that impress without sacrificing the warmth necessary for survival. The workshop itself is an environment of privilege. It is sufficiently heated to allow for fine work impossible with frozen fingers. It has adequate lighting, multiple lamps or candles allowing precision, even in the long months of darkness. It has supplies, bolts of cloth, spools of thread in various colors, proper metal needles that do not break or bend easily, specialized tools for cutting, shaping, finishing. An apprentice tailor in Yakutsk clothes, at least in terms of working conditions, better than most independent settlers. The work is indoors, relatively warm and bright. The skills learned are valuable and portable, potentially leading to independent practice and real prosperity. The clothing worn while working is adequate, provided by the master tailor as part of the apprentice arrangement. Not luxurious, but functional, well-maintained, sufficient for the limited outdoor exposure required to move about the town. The contrast is starkly visible when a merchant walks through the town's markets wearing his matched frocks, minus fur, shabay and fine boots. He passes settlers who have come in from outlying areas to trade, dressed in their patchwork coats and crude felt boots. The difference is immediate. A merchant moves fluidly because his clothing fits and is not overly bulky, allowing full range of motion. The settler moves stiffly, hampered by layers that are too large or too small, ad hoc repairs creating awkward bulk or restricting joint movement. The merchant's face is protected by a well-designed hood that deflects wind without restricting vision or hearing. A settler's face is oft unwrapped in cloth and scarf, only the eyes visible, because their hood is inadequate or non-existent. The merchant's hands are gloved in a way that allows him to conduct business, count coins, inspect goods, weigh in a ledger without fully exposing hand protection. The settler's hands are mittened in a way that any task requiring fine motor control means exposing bare skin to the cold, walking fast before numbness sets in, and covering up again as quickly as possible. Yet the comfort of the elite is not absolute. Their clothing, while superior, does not grant them immunity to winter's dangers. The cold in Yakutsk can reach minus 50 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. At such temperatures, even the best furs and thickest layers provide only temporary protection. Prolonged exposure would kill the merchant as surely as the settler, perhaps only slightly less quickly. The wealthy understand this. Their behavior reflects it. They minimize time outdoors, plan movements carefully, to maintain a healthy respect for the power of the cold. They also have anxiety. Supply lines can be severed by weather or by political upheaval further west. Caravans bringing imported fabrics, quality furs, other luxuries may not arrive, or arrive with diminished stocks, driving up prices, creating scarcity even for the moneyed. Theft is a constant concern. Phones are extremely valuable and relatively portable, making them attractive targets. More than one merchant has found his warehouse broken into during the long winter night, his stock of furs gone, a loss representing years of work, one that may take years to recover. Fire is perhaps the greatest fear. The stoves that heat so effectively can also blaze out of control. A winter fire is catastrophic. If your dwelling burns in summer, you can rebuild or lodge temporarily with neighbors while making other arrangements. If your dwelling burns in winter, especially in the coldest months, you face immediate, life-threatening exposure. If you lose your winter clothing and that fire clothing that represents such investment, that provides such protection, you are suddenly vulnerable in a way wealth cannot immediately remedy. You can buy new clothing, yes, but best shub still takes time to commission. Until it is ready, you make do with whatever can be procured quickly, and you may discover, for the first time, how thin the line between comfort and misery, between status and vulnerability truly is. The priests and officials of Yakutsk face similar conditions from a different position. They obtain quality clothing through institutional connections. The Orthodox Church provides its clergy with appropriate garments, understanding that a priest incapacitated by cold cannot effectively serve a community. The thick cassock a priest wears is quilted, lined with wool wadding. Its hem is long to protect the legs. It has a deep hood that can be pulled over the head. These garments are black, the traditional color for Orthodox clergy, but the dye is expensive. The cloth a tightly woven good wool. Over the cassock, the priest wears a heavy felt or fur cloak when traveling between churches or visiting parishioners. They carry the authority of their office, which grants them access to heated spaces and a degree of respect. Even in the worst conditions, administrative officials wear uniforms. While not as warm as a merchant's shabby, they are still far superior to settler clothing. Uniforms are standardized, represent the distant power of the empire, and come with winter clothing allowances or stipulations. An official might receive a coat allowance money specifically designated for purchasing proper cold-weather gear, an acknowledgement that the government's representatives needed to be able to function regardless of weather. These officials often had access to military supply chains, which could provide boots, gloves, other items manufactured in European Russian shipped east. The quality was variable. Military supply was notorious for corruption and inefficiency. That even mediocre factory-made items were often better than what could be improvised on the frontier. Garrison soldiers occupy a middle place in the clothing hierarchy. They are issued uniforms, including winter gear, but the quality is typically poor, the quantities insufficient. The soldier might receive a winter greatcoat expected to last multiple seasons, and a basic pair of felt boots that wear out quickly under heavy use. Soldiers supplement their issued gear through trade or purchase when they can afford to, when they cannot. Winter guard duty is especially brutal for soldiers, standing still for hours in extreme cold, unable to move enough to generate body heat, and inadequate clothing. Many soldiers suffered frostbite to feet, hands, and face. Some lost toes or fingers, ending their military careers with a pension barely sufficient for survival. The military response to this problem was sporadic and often inadequate, sometimes providing extra layers or allowing shorter shifts, sometimes simply accepting casualties as the inevitable cost of maintaining order. Within the garrison, an informal economy developed around clothing modification and repair. Soldiers with tailoring or cobbling skills could earn extra goods or favors by improving their comrades' gear, lining a greatcoat, reinforcing boots, making gloves from scavenged materials. This economy existed in the space between official regulations and practical necessity, tolerated by commanders who understood survival sometimes required flexibility. The small medical establishment in the town aid octrine, a few assistants trained in basic care regularly saw the consequences of clothing failure. Cases of frostbite arrived in waves during the coldest periods, ranging from mild injuries that healed on their own to severe cases requiring amputation. The doctor could often tell, by examining the affected tissue, what kind of clothing the patient had been wearing when injured. Severely frostbitten toes with the feet otherwise fine suggested boots with inadequate insulation. Frostbitten fingertips while the rest of the hand was spared suggested gloves that were too loose or poorly constructed. Facial frostbite suggested insufficient hood or scarf coverage. Each injury pattern told a story of material failure, with clothing insufficient for the harsh arithmetic of winter small inadequacies that could add up to serious harm. The doctor's advice was straightforward: at impractical better clothing, less exposure, more attention to early warning signs. At this advice collided with economic reality. People wore what they could afford or make. They stayed as long as work required, and by the time they noticed the early signs of frostbite numbness, pale skin were oft uncommitted to staying out until a task was finished before they could return to warmth. The doctor treated symptoms as best he could, occasionally petitioned authorities for better supplies for soldiers or aid for particularly destitute families, but ultimately accepted he was treating the consequences of a system he could not change. The elite, from their relatively comfortable positions, observed these casualties with a mixture of concern and rationalization. Some genuinely wanted to help, offering old clothing to those in need, hiring people in ways that allowed them to earn enough for better gear, supporting church-organized charity efforts. Others simply accepted this as the natural order. Some had more, some had less. While suffering was regrettable, it was ultimately not their responsibility to solve. This attitude was not necessarily cruel or pragmatic, rooted in a worldview where social hierarchy was seen as inevitable, and one's primary obligation was to one's own family on station. Sometimes these worlds collided in ways that revealed the depth of the divide. A merchant's son, playing in the snow near his family's dwelling, might encounter settler children who would come to town with their parents. The merchant's son would be dressed in fitted woolens, a small but well-made fur over the proper boots and gloves. The settler children would be wearing oversized, worn hand-me-downs, often without proper gloves, their hands wrapped in cloth and stuffed into a pair of oversized adult mittens. The children might play together briefly, building a snowman or having a snowball fight. In that moment, the differences in their clothing, their circumstances, their futures, would be vividly apparent. The merchant's son would be called inside after a reasonable time, lest he become a child. Elder children would remain outside until their parents' business was concluded, however long, because there was no warm place for them to wait. The merchant's son's clothing would be dried and maintained by thieving. The settler children's clothing would be dried by a smoky fire in a cramped dwelling, and if not completely dry, put on damp the next day, for there were no alternatives. One child would grow up understanding winter as an inconvenience, something to be managed with proper resources. The other would understand winter as a trial, something to be endured with determination and constant vigilance. Yet this divide was not in all cases unbridgeable. Wealth on the frontier was more unstable than in more settled regions. Merchant could lose everything in a single catastrophic event. Fire, theft, a supply caravan that never arrived, a shift in trade routes, a political change that eliminated his connections. The fall from privilege could be swift and devastating. Conversely, a settler with skill, luck, and determination could occasionally rise, slowly accumulate resources, eventually establish himself as prosperous, if not exactly elite. The clothing a person wore could change over a lifetime, could chart a trajectory from poverty to comfort, or from comfort to desperation. A person wearing a patchwork coat at 20 might, if fortune smiled, wear a proper shabby at 50. A person who inherited a good coat at 20 might, if fortune frowned, trade it for food at 50, and wear rags. The harsh conditions of the frontier had